Causes of World War II. Treaty of Versailles and the aftermath of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formally ended World War I but left deep wounds that would fester into World War II. The treaty placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany, imposed crippling reparations, and stripped the country of significant territory. This punitive approach aimed to prevent Germany from becoming a military threat again, but it had severe economic and political consequences. The treaty created widespread resentment in Germany, where many viewed it as a diktat, an imposed peace that humiliated the nation. This sentiment of humiliation, coupled with economic instability, set the stage for the rise of radical ideologies, particularly Nazism. The harsh terms of the treaty were viewed as unjust not only by Germans but by many historians and political analysts, who argued that it sowed the seeds for the next major conflict. Economic instability and the Great Depression. The global economic collapse triggered by the Great Depression in 1929 further exacerbated the political instability in Europe. Nations around the world struggled with unemployment, poverty, and a loss of faith in democratic institutions. In Germany, the economic depression hit especially hard, leading to hyperinflation, widespread unemployment, and severe social unrest. These conditions created fertile ground for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise to power by promising a return to national greatness and economic recovery. Hitler's rhetoric of blaming Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies resonated with a populace desperate for solutions. The economic instability was not limited to Germany. Italy and Japan also experienced economic crises, which contributed to the rise of fascism and militarism in these countries. The rise of totalitarian regimes. By the early 1930s, totalitarian regimes had gained control in several key countries. In Germany, Hitler became chancellor in 1933 and quickly consolidated power, transforming the Weimar Republic into a fascist dictatorship. Hitler's aggressive nationalism, militarism, and expansionist goals were key factors leading to the outbreak of war. In Italy, Benito Mussolini established a fascist regime that sought to restore Italy's former imperial glory. Japan, under Emperor Hirohito, had become increasingly militaristic, with expansionist ambitions in Asia. These regimes shared a common goal: the rejection of the post-World War I international order and a desire for territorial expansion. Totalitarianism emphasized the power of the state over the individual, leading to aggressive foreign policies aimed at conquering new territories and subjugating other nations. Failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, established after World War I as a means of preventing future conflicts, was ineffective in halting the aggression of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s. The League lacked the authority and military power to enforce its decisions, and key nations like the United States did not join. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League failed to take decisive action. Its inability to respond effectively to these acts of aggression emboldened other nations, particularly Nazi Germany, to pursue expansionist policies. The League's failure highlighted the weaknesses of collective security and international diplomacy in the face of determined dictatorships. The policy of appeasement. In an effort to avoid another devastating war, Britain and France pursued a policy of appeasement toward Hitler in the 1930s. This policy, most famously associated with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, involved making concessions to Germany in the hope that satisfying Hitler's demands would prevent further conflict. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, was the most prominent example of appeasement. However, rather than preventing war, appeasement only encouraged Hitler to pursue more aggressive actions. The policy ultimately failed when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, prompting Britain and France to declare war. The outbreak of war. Invasion of Poland, 1939. World War II began on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. The invasion was swift and brutal, utilizing the German tactic of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which involved rapid advances by tanks and aircraft. Poland was quickly overwhelmed, and by the end of September, the country was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, which had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact just weeks earlier. This non-aggression pact between the two powers secretly included a provision to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The invasion of Poland prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany on September 3, 1939, marking the official start of World War II, the phony war and early Axis successes. After the fall of Poland, there was a period of relative inactivity on the Western Front known as the Phony War, which lasted until the spring of 1940. However, during this time, Germany solidified its control over Poland and prepared for further military campaigns. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing critical strategic positions and access to resources. This was followed by the invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in May and June 1940. France, despite its extensive defensive preparations along the Maginot Line, was quickly overrun by the German blitzkrieg, and by mid-June, Paris had fallen. The fall of France was a significant blow to the Allies and marked a period of Axis dominance in Europe. The Battle of Britain. After the fall of France, Hitler turned his attention to Britain, which now stood alone against Nazi Germany in Western Europe. In the summer and autumn of 1940, Germany launched a massive aerial campaign known as the Battle of Britain, with the goal of gaining air superiority and preparation for a potential invasion of the British Isles. The German Luftwaffe targeted British airfields, infrastructure, and cities, but the Royal Air Force, RAF, aided by radar technology and superior tactics, successfully defended the country. The failure of the Luftwaffe to gain air superiority forced Hitler to abandon plans for an invasion, marking the first major defeat for Germany in the war. The Battle of Britain was a turning point that demonstrated the resilience of the British people and military. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This marked a dramatic shift in the war, as Hitler broke the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in pursuit of his goal of conquering Eastern Europe. The invasion was the largest military operation in history, involving millions of German troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft. Initially, the Germans made rapid advances, capturing vast swathes of Soviet territory, including Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. However, as the German forces approached Moscow, they were met with fierce resistance and the harsh realities of the Russian winter. By the end of 1941, the German advance had stalled, and the Soviets began to regroup for a counteroffensive. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of the Eastern Front, which would become the largest and deadliest theater of the war, the global conflict. The War in the Pacific. While the war in Europe raged, Japan pursued its own expansionist ambitions in Asia and the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This attack, which aimed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, led to the United States' entry into World War II. Japan followed up with a series of rapid conquests in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The war in the Pacific became a brutal and protracted conflict, characterized by fierce island-hopping campaigns, naval battles, and the widespread use of aircraft carriers. The United States, along with its allies, including Australia and China, eventually turned the tide of the war through decisive victories at battles such as Midway in June 1942 and the Guadalcanal Campaign. The North African Campaign. The war in North Africa was another critical theater of World War II, where the Axis and Allied forces fought for control of strategic territories and resources. Italy had initially invaded Egypt in 1940, but the British counterattacked and drove the Italians back. In early 1941, Germany sent the Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel, to support the Italian forces. Rommel's tactical brilliance earned him the nickname the Desert Fox, and his forces achieved several significant victories, pushing the British back toward Egypt. However, by 1942, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies, particularly after the decisive Battle of El Alamein in October and November of that year. The victory at El Alamein, combined with the Allied landings in French North Africa, Operation Torch, forced the Axis powers to retreat from North Africa by May 1943. The Eastern Front, Stalingrad and Kursk. The Eastern Front was the most brutal and destructive theater of World War II, with millions of soldiers and civilians killed. One of the key turning points in the war came at the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. The battle was one of the bloodiest in history, with intense urban combat and massive casualties on both sides. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a major counteroffensive against the Germans, who were forced to retreat from the city. Following Stalingrad, the Soviets achieved another significant victory at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. These defeats severely weakened the German forces on the Eastern Front, and from this point on, the Soviets steadily pushed the Germans back toward Berlin, the turning of the tide. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. One of the most critical moments of World War II came on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, when the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. This operation began with the largest amphibious assault in history, as Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion was a massive logistical feat, involving thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. Despite fierce German resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach, the Allies successfully established a beachhead, allowing them to push further into France. Within weeks, Allied forces had liberated Paris, and by the fall of 1944, much of France was free from German control. D-Day was a turning point in the European theater, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany as Allied forces advanced toward Germany from the west. The liberation of Western Europe. After the success of the Normandy invasion, Allied forces rapidly advanced across Western Europe. In late 1944 and early 1945, the Allies liberated Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. However, the Germans launched a final counteroffensive in December 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, in an attempt to break through the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. Despite initial successes, the Germans were eventually defeated, and this marked the collapse of Nazi Germany's ability to wage an offensive war. By early 1945, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine River into Germany, and the Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The liberation of Europe was now in full swing, and the final collapse of the Nazi regime was imminent. The fall of Berlin. As Allied forces pressed in from the west and Soviet forces from the east, the final battle for Berlin began in April 1945. The Soviet Red Army launched a massive assault on the city, and after weeks of intense urban combat, they captured Berlin. Hitler, realizing that the war was lost, committed suicide in his underground bunker on April 30, 1945. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, marking the end of the war in Europe. This event is commemorated as Victory in Europe, VE, Day. The fall of Berlin and the end of the war in Europe marked the defeat of Nazi Germany, but the war in the Pacific still raged on. The War in the Pacific. Island hopping campaigns and the Battle of Midway. In the Pacific, the United States adopted a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and capturing strategically important islands that would bring them closer to Japan. One of the most critical battles in this campaign was the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The United States Navy, under Admiral Chester Nimitz, achieved a decisive victory by sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, severely weakening Japan's naval power. This battle was a turning point in the Pacific War, as it halted Japanese expansion and put the United States on the offensive. From that point on, the United States continued to gain ground in the Pacific, capturing key islands such as Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. The atomic bomb and Japan's surrender. By mid-1945, Japan's defeat was imminent, but the country refused to surrender unconditionally. To avoid a costly invasion of Japan's home islands, the United States made the fateful decision to use atomic weapons. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands of people instantly and leveling much of the city. 3 days later, on August 9, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, causing further devastation. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, effectively bringing World War II to an end. The official surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, marking the conclusion of the deadliest conflict in human history. The consequences of World War II. Human cost and destruction. World War II was the deadliest conflict in history, with an estimated 70 million to 85 million people killed, including military personnel and civilians. The war resulted in widespread destruction across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of people were displaced. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews and millions of others were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime, remains one of the darkest chapters of the war. The immense human suffering, combined with the devastation of infrastructure and economies, had long-lasting effects on the post-war world. The United Nations and the post-war order. In the aftermath of World War II, world leaders sought to prevent future conflicts on the scale of the two world wars. In 1945, the United Nations, UN, was established to promote international cooperation and prevent future wars. Unlike the League of Nations, the UN had broader participation and stronger mechanisms for peacekeeping. The UN Charter emphasized the principles of sovereignty, human rights, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. The formation of the UN marked the beginning of a new era in international relations, with the hope of fostering a more stable and peaceful world order. The Cold War. The end of World War II also marked the beginning of the Cold War, a prolonged period of political, military, and ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although they had been allies during the war, deep-seated differences between the capitalist West and the communist East quickly emerged. The division of Germany and the establishment of Soviet-controlled regimes in Eastern Europe contributed to the growing tension between the two superpowers. The Cold War would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades, leading to numerous proxy wars, nuclear arms races, and the division of the world into opposing blocs. Decolonization and global change. World War II had a profound impact on the colonial empires of Europe. The war weakened the European powers economically and militarily, making it difficult for them to maintain control over their colonies. In the decades following the war, many nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East achieved independence, leading to a wave of decolonization. The war also marked the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant global superpowers, reshaping the global political landscape. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established new economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which would play key roles in the post-war economic order. Legacy of World War II. Technological and military innovations. World War II saw significant technological and military innovations, many of which would have a lasting impact on future conflicts and civilian life. The development of radar, jet engines, and the atomic bomb were among the most significant technological advancements. The war also saw the widespread use of aircraft carriers, tanks, and submarines in naval and ground warfare. These innovations revolutionized modern warfare, and many of the technologies developed during the war would later be adapted for civilian use, such as computers and medical advancements. The Holocaust and human rights. The atrocities committed during World War II, particularly the Holocaust, had a profound impact on global consciousness and the development of international human rights. The Nuremberg trials, held after the war to prosecute Nazi war criminals, set a precedent for the prosecution of crimes against humanity. The revelations of the Holocaust led to a renewed focus on human rights, and in 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The legacy of the Holocaust continues to shape discussions about genocide, justice, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The European Union and integration. In the aftermath of the war, European nations sought to prevent further conflicts by fostering greater economic and political cooperation. This desire for integration eventually led to the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which later evolved into the European Union. The EU was created to promote economic interdependence and prevent the rise of nationalism that had contributed to the outbreak of the world wars. The European Union has since become one of the most significant examples of regional cooperation, promoting peace and stability in Europe. The memory of World War II. World War II remains one of the most significant events in modern history, and its memory continues to influence global politics, culture, and society. Memorials, museums, and annual commemorations around the world honor the millions who died in the conflict, while films, books, and other media continue to explore its complex legacy. The war's lessons about the dangers of totalitarianism, unchecked aggression, and genocide have shaped international efforts to promote peace and prevent future atrocities. World War II's legacy is a reminder of the human capacity for both destruction and resilience, and its impact continues to resonate across generations. World War II was a global conflict of unprecedented scale and devastation, involving the majority of the world's nations and leaving a lasting impact on human history. The war reshaped the political, social, and economic landscape of the 20th century, leading to the rise of new superpowers, the collapse of colonial empires, and the establishment of international institutions designed to promote peace. Its legacy includes both the horrors of war and the efforts to build a more just and peaceful world. The lessons of World War II remain relevant today, as the international community continues to grapple with issues of war, peace, and human rights.